Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you, everyone, for what has been an extraordinary day. It's tough to be at the last of the papers, and one is often tempted to rewrite on the fly, but I won't do that. Partly because in American English, the very phrase solidary economy, which was the early rendering of phrase that had emerged in Spanish, Portuguese, and French, seems odd. And even the more recent translation, solidarity economy, is not yet part of the idiom of the social movements in the United States, let alone of the culture as a whole. So this afternoon, I'd like to just briefly reflect on the origins of the notion, as well as its several meanings and connotations, and beg forgiveness of the Ecuadorians who already know some of this history better than I think we do in the U.S. It is by now a commonplace that the social movements of the long 1968 were, as Emanuel Wallerstein put it, a revolt against the very forms invented by the social movements of 1848, particularly the political party itself, whether the mass parliamentary party or the elite vanguard cadre party, as well as labor unions and nationalist formations. As a result, the movements of the generation of 1968 rethought social movement actors as liberation movements emerged of women, of ethnicized and racialized peoples, of gays and lesbians, of nature itself. And social movement strategies were rethought as new forms of direct action, from mass civil disobedience to guerrilla focos, were developed. There was a flourishing of utopian speculation and communitarian experiment, as well as a widespread critique of the forms of actually existing socialism, the social democracies of the North Atlantic, the communisms of Eurasia, and the post-colonial import substitution industrial nationalisms of the southern tricontinent. But not surprisingly, perhaps, there was relatively little rethinking of the forms of a post-capitalist economy until those movements began slowly and fitfully to become governing forces. And it's really out of this second moment that the discourse and practice of a solidarity economy emerges, most strikingly in the Brazilian movement. Many of the earliest debates took place not only within the Workers' Party, the first party of the world left that was not an inheritor of that great divide between social democracy and communism, but also within the New Labor Federation, the CUT, the base communities of liberation theology, the landless movement, and the World Social Forums, which assembled the new movement of movements. As early as 1994, the National Association of Workers in Self-Managed and Profit-Sharing Enterprises was formed in Brazil, followed by the Union and Solidarity of the Cooperatives of the state of São Paulo, leading to the creation of a National Secretariat of the Solidarity Economy by Lula's Workers' Party government a decade ago in 2003. The solidarity economy basically means, in the words of Paul Zinger, one of the leading Brazilian advocates and theorists, collective self-help in order to generate work and income for people who are deprived of both. The theory and practice of a solidarity economy marked a fairly distinct break from the state-led socialisms of the mid-20th century through its reevaluation of the economic forms and practices that lie in the space between what was imagined as capitalism and socialism, but also between what was traditionally imagined as the private and the public. The worlds of cooperatives, mutual benefit associations, and nonprofit organizations. These are not merely community groups and social movements. Rather, as a recent ILO mapping of the solidarity economy puts it, their main distinguishing feature is that they produce goods and services. Cooperatives have existed for generations, of course, but I think they took on a new centrality under neoliberalism for three reasons. First, the politicization of consumption, the emergence of consumer movements, as well as the critique of a society which understands well-being only as excessive and conspicuous consumption, has meant that the flourishing of consumer cooperatives nurtured a new politics of the commodity chain, including fair trade initiatives, the promotion of organic and sustainable agriculture, the local sourcing of products. Second, the explosion of informal, precarious work under neoliberalism has led wageless workers to develop a host of mutual benefit associations to share risks cooperatively and to regulate the informal economy. These include marketing cooperatives of trash and waste recyclers, credit unions for street vendors, health cooperatives for wageless workers. And third, since factory closings due to the massive industrial relocations rendered the strike, the traditional weapon of workers, ineffective, a wave of workplace occupations of bankrupt companies led to the revitalization of production cooperatives. The most wide-ranging and dramatic instance took place in Argentina after the financial crisis of 2001 had left Argentines without their life savings, their back wages, and their jobs. And two national movements of recovered factories led to hundreds of workplaces with thousands of workers taken over and run by the workers. Many of the best known have been in goods manufacturing, textiles, metalworking, auto parts, but they spread beyond the factory to the service sector as workers began running supermarkets, hospitals, hotels, and schools. Even in the United States, in the fall, after the fall 2008 financial crisis, led a group of workers, mostly Latino immigrants, to take over an about-to-close window and door factory on Chicago's Goose Island and occupy it for 6 days, attracting substantial press coverage as well as President-elect Obama's endorsement. The tactics succeeded not only in the short term, the workers won a settlement with severance pay, but it also led, after several years of struggle, false hopes, and a second occupation, to the formation of a cooperative, New Era Windows, by 24 of the workers, including the original leaders of the occupation. And with the support of a nonprofit that had helped finance some of the recovered factories in Argentina, they began production in Chicago this year. There are many difficulties and contradictions in each of these forms: the relation to stockholders, suppliers, clients, marketers, creditors, the relation among workers and with pre-existing divisions of labor, the relation to the state, both to its police forces and its bankruptcy courts. In many places, as workers become owners of cooperatives, they lose the labor rights for which they had fought, a debate that took place in the Brazilian CUT. And there are debates about whether the workplaces should become worker-owned cooperatives or government-owned public enterprises. Nonetheless, the result of this history has been to bring into visibility an entire economic sector that is neither state nor market, a third sector by some accounts, a distinct mode of production in Zinger's analysis. Several theorists of the solidarity economy have invoked Polanyi's efforts to understand plural principles of economic exchange, placing the marketing principle that we know so much about alongside the householding principle, the redistribution principle, and the reciprocity principle. Moreover, though clearly overshadowed by capitalist enterprises and by nation states, the solidarity economy is not insignificant. The International Cooperative Alliance says there are almost 1 billion cooperative members and more than 100 million jobs in the cooperative sector in 91 countries that they are connected to. And when the Brazilian Forum for the Solidarity Economy undertook a mapping of the social economy in 2009, they were able to identify 22,000 solidarity economy enterprises, of which, and this was quite striking, a third had no legal status and would not have appeared in official statistics. This attempt to map, recognize, and support the solidarity economy is itself part of the ideological struggles that have accompanied the transition from Fordism to the neoliberal post-Fordisms that have dominated the last quarter century. And these debates owe much to the critique of GDP as an index of development, a critique developed by feminists, ecologists, health advocates, and radical developmental economists, a critique emblemized by the creation of the Human Development Index in 1990 as an alternative measure. I'll slow down a bit there. This happened to me earlier. And an index which we've heard and seen used this today. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the discussion of the economies of solidarity in Ecuador and in Bolivia is the way it is drawn on the social practices of the indigenous peoples of the Andes and the Amazon, implicitly developing an important thread in Latin American radical thought, exemplified by Peru's Mariátegui. Alberto Acosta's account of the solidarity economy begins from a reflection on the specific institutions of indigenous production and exchange. The Minca, a mechanism of collective work. The Ranti-Ranti, a principle of reciprocal barter. The Waki, the distribution of farming land and products. The Chuchinca, the right to collect leftover crops, what might be called gleaning in other terms. Among others, there's a whole variety of these. And for the most part, one does not yet find this dialogue with indigenous thought and practice in North American or European theorizations of the solidarity economy. Even in Quebec, which is generally taken to be the most developed North American example of the solidarity economy, with significant nonprofit cooperatives supported by the state providing child care and home health care, there seems to be little interchange between the French and Catholic sources of Quebec's solidarity economy thought and indigenous practices in ideas, though it does seem that there have been connections between solidarity economy networks and Quebec's First Nations over the last 2 or 3 years. It's also worth noting that this revaluation of the economics of solidarity is not entirely separate from some mainstream economic thinking, particularly the economics of happiness, which has been a key part of contemporary centrist and conservative political projects in the wake of the crisis of 2008. Like development, well-being is a category that can be mobilized with radically different valences. The solidarity economy can be recast as civil society, worker cooperatives as social enterprises, credit unions as microcredit, and all are mobilized in the name of private initiatives that are superior to the state's public sector. The pursuit of happiness in the big society can sometimes be a way to gut the welfare of the great society. In the face of this, it is necessary to insist, as Amir Sadr does in his wonderful survey of Latin American radical thought, that we do not remain prisoners of the theoretical framework produced by neoliberalism itself, the opposition of public and private. It is not the private sphere, he writes, that characterizes the neoliberal project. When a company is privatized, it is not the workers who acquire it, but the market which takes control. What really drives the neoliberal scheme, he writes, is commodification. Democratization means decommodifying. Overcoming neoliberalism requires a refounding of the state. The solidarity economy is often cast as a socialism of the 21st century. But I would suggest that perhaps it's less a model of a socialism to come than an exploration of some of the ways of decommodifying and democratizing work, of getting beyond wage labor by drawing on the experiences of the waged and unwaged alike. The recognition and support of the cooperatives and credit unions of the solidarity economy is a fundamental part of any refounding of a post-neoliberal state. I can slow down. I actually have only one paragraph in 5 minutes. Okay. In the United States, traditions of the cooperative commonwealth are deeply embedded in our social movements. We might even recall that the largest organization of the U.S. Popular Front was not the Communist Party, but the International Workers' Order, which provided insurance for working people, particularly African Americans, who are excluded from commercial insurance. Even now, Gar Apolovitz points out, more than 40% of the U.S. population are members of one form or another of cooperative, including agricultural co-ops, electrical co-ops prevalent in many rural areas, insurance co-ops, food co-ops, retail co-ops, health co-ops, artist co-ops, credit unions. However, this solidarity economy remains almost entirely unrecognized by the U.S. state. We have no cabinet position for the solidarity economy. And it's unrecognized by popular culture, and indeed, you probably know many of these co-ops have become bureaucratized and lost some of their solidarity elements. But as the story of New Era Windows shows, and as the story of New Era Windows shows, it remains a difficult struggle to form and sustain cooperatives. We are only beginning to imagine that another production and another consumption is possible. Thank you.